Well, welcome everybody to our webinar here in October, and it is our 2023-2024 Winter Outlook. I'm meteorologist Mike Mahalik here at WeatherWorks. I've been here since 2008, and joining me today is Ken Elliott, another senior meteorologist here at WeatherWorks. Ken, why don't you introduce yourself to those listening out there?
Sure, yeah, I've been here just a smidge longer than you have, and Mike, these are kind of scary now. Every year we tick down another year, and it's like, uh-oh. But anyway, excited to be here. We got a lot of good stuff to get to.
Yeah,
We talk about national seasonal overview, kind of as a general start. Then we
right.
really started to hit home on some of the things to look for, some of the themes we'll be seeing this year, some of the data analysis of some of the other winters that look similar to what we think this one will be. Then we go into some in-depth forecast on a bi-monthly forecast level, and we've got a few surprise little extras in there this year too, which I think everyone's going to enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. But Ken, before we go into the actual seasonal outlook and what we're expecting, I just wanted to cover El Nino first because that's a big hot topic, it seems like, whether it's with our forecast or in the media. But El Nino is here this year. And we had a few questions too from our registrants about what is the difference between El Nino and La Nina. La Nina is what we had last year. So basically, La Nina, what we had last year, is cooler water in the tropical Pacific. It gives you a weaker subtropical jet, so a weaker moisture feed across the southern portion of the United States, but it keeps the northern jet stream or the polar jet stream a lot stronger. Now, it's basically flipped that for what we have this year. We have an El Nino. So this means that the subtropical jet stream is going to be providing a lot of moisture. It's stronger, so that's going to be adding all that wet weather across the southern portion of the United States. And as you go further north, the polar jet stream is a little bit weaker. But that's not to say that is a bad thing, that's for sure, if you're looking for snow, because with all that extra moisture, there's certainly a lot of potential there this year with the forecast, Ken.
Yeah,
And
absolutely, Mike. And you kind of alluded to it. The big elephant in the room this year is the subtropical jet stream. I mean, we've been 3 years in a row of La Nina winters. It seems like it's been like 10, but
absolutely.
it's only been three. And I mean, just by, and you mentioned it earlier at the top, it's just a complete reversal from where we've been. So,
Right.
wherever you happen to be in the country, whatever winter you happen to have experienced, it's not going to be the same this year. We feel very confident in that just because that subtropical jet stream will mean business this year. A lot more activity on the southern flank.
Right.
And again, like you mentioned, northern jet stream not quite as powerful, but still not dead. And that's a big distinction to make. There'll still be
Right.
plenty of disturbances going along it. So don't be too worried if you're on the northern tier of the United States. We'll have some snow there as well.
And it's important that what we're showing here is our composite or analog map. So it's kind of a mishmash between all the years we're looking at and the El Nino underlying signal. And an analog is basically a prior winter that shows similar characteristics to what we're expecting for this upcoming winter. So this is what we're expecting for a pattern, and that's what we use to do a lot of our predictions for the long range. The analogs are pretty much important to this. There might be 9, 10 analogs that we actually analyze to come up with these actual seasonal maps. So here it is, guys. Here is our winter outlook. Now this is for the season as a whole, Ken. And why don't you take it, go through it here with us, with our viewers out there.
Sure, yeah. The big hallmark obviously is the southern subtropical jet stream, very active. So not a surprise if you see a large swath of the southern and notably eastern United States. It's not just the southern. A lot of that moisture will work up the coast at times. So places like New York City, even Boston, occasionally getting it on that action. For the closer south and to the coast, you are a little bit more. But again, it's not like all of a sudden there's gonna be like this massive block where all of a sudden you get above New York City, for example, and there's no moisture. That's not the case here. Along with that activity, especially the further south you go, it's gonna be cooler too. Makes sense, right? A lot of these places that would ordinarily be, mild to warm in the winter, they're not gonna be as warm. It's just because it's gonna be, more precipitation, less
Yep.
sunshine, that sort of thing. And The further north you go, maybe into like the mid-south, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley, these sorts of areas will probably cash in on both being a little bit cooler, a little bit moist. So these are kind of areas which we'll see in a minute, which will kind of highlight for some above normal snowfall in a little bit. We'll kind of put some contours to that in probably about 30 seconds.
Mm,
Further north, a little bit milder than average. Now, again, I know it looks kind of reddish. Let's not forget how cold the winter is in the northern tier. This is probably not the winter where we'll see 2 weeks where Minneapolis struggles to get above 5 degrees. True. However, their average high in a lot of these places in Fargo stays in the 20s in the middle of winter. So even 5 degrees above normal, which would be statistically significant, is still pretty cold. So again, less cold, less harsh. I think that's the takeaway here. And again, you see some below average precipitation, but it's not a shutout. Kind of mentioned that before. The northern jet stream is still there. It's not dead. There will be disturbances riding along it, but probably a little bit less moisture than usual because it'll be a little further north and a little less to pick up on. So those are the big themes nationally. Now, we'll keep that precipitation map up there for a second to kind of give an idea of how we think that's going to go. But I think it's time, Mike, to show the snow map.
mm,
There we are. Yeah, and again, not surprising. Southern U.S., again, places that can snow but don't frequently snow. So southern Appalachians, Atlanta, places along those lines, a couple of miles, 50 to 100 miles plus away from the Gulf. These will be sneaky good places this year. The winter nationally, those probably further west where you would expect Four Corners, Rockies, and Sierra. However, more interesting areas, mid-Atlantic and Northeast, snowiest later on. Absolutely. We'll get into that a little bit more in our bi-monthlies. But yeah, I think it'll be an interesting middle and back end of this season up there. And even though, even in New England, we have snow averages that are near, maybe slightly below normal, that's not to say the pattern's not active. I think it will be. So
right.
even if it's not necessarily, straight snow events where, it's blizzard after blizzard, there will be some lighter events, probably some mixed events, keeping totals down. And even earlier on in the year, a couple of cold air intrusions, we get, refreezes and mixes on the backside of mainly rain events. So, there's that going on there. And again, we talked about the northern tier from like, say, the Northwest across the Great Lakes earlier, milder, but still chilly. I mean, it's still cold. You take somebody from like, Virginia Beach and put them up there and they'd say it'd be cold. And I do believe it will be cold up there, just not quite as cold as we're used to. But again, lighter snowfalls. And really, we'll talk about this a little bit too. Frequency of actual events is not all that, we don't expect it to be a whole lot below normal either. So
Right.
a lot of stuff we'll get into as we go through here, but these are kind of like the big themes for the season.
Right, absolutely. And Ken, I think the real key in this forecast is going to be that transition zone here from the Tennessee Valley up through the Appalachian, through the Mid-Atlantic and southern New England. That's going to be a real, tight area where, you're going to be between a lot of heavy precipitation and also some cold air intrusions. So that can go kind of either way. And
And it'll
and like,
move too. I mean, it's not, this
yeah,
map is
it's not
kind of
going to
like
stay
this is a static map, obviously,
there.
but from time to time, this will move 50, 100, 150 miles, depending upon exactly where that storm comes out of. So yeah, again, this is like kind of like an average, and there will be times where it gets further up into the Ohio Valley and into New England. The other times will be more suppressed. So again, and that makes the winter all the more interesting from our aspect because and more difficult to forecast too when we get closer to
Right.
those events because those become more fickle. But yeah, these areas that are kind of like in these normalish colors,
Hmm.
it's going to be a very busy winter with at least a lot of threats. A couple of them probably won't pan out, but with cold air further south than usual, a busy jet stream. Those ingredients, they're just there, and something's got to happen at some point with them. And we think a lot of that something waits till the back half of winter.
Right. So let's kind of wrap up what Ken talked about there in our key points across the nation. So, right, what we were talking about, frequent storms keep temperatures below normal across the southern United States. But hey, it's still cold up north. Remember, the highest risk of persistent cold in the Northeast and the Midwest is likely later in winter, with February is where we're really keying on. A lot of our analogs are talking about February a lot, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean that there can't be something that kind of threads the needle early on. And like Ken mentioned, we'll get into that a little bit later on in the program here. Active subtropical jet stream brings a lot of moisture and snow across the south there, across the southwest and the intermountain, or I'm sorry, across the interior south. And then moving on, we'll have those clashing air masses, like I mentioned in the last slide, from New England down through the Ohio Valley, where there's going to be some mixed precipitation. And the warmer Great Lakes are going to be interesting too, Ken. We didn't really mention it before, but I think that lake effect is going to hang on a little bit longer. We're not going to get those lakes to freeze up as quickly as they normally do. So that could help keep totals on a little bit of the higher side when you get closer to those lake belts. And then the Southern Rockies and Four Corners are obviously going to see the most amount of snow, with the El Nino really kicking and bringing in a lot of moisture to the region. So that's kind of a recap of everything across the country, but let's kind of break it down, Ken, uh, with some major cities around the country here, and give our idea of what we expect for seasonal averages. Now, Ken, we broke this down into three different groups: a below average range, near normal, and above average range. And that kind of mimics what we do in our storm alert product, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We've done this for, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years now, where we kind of try to, we kind of put more of a storm alert style to our winter forecast, which makes sense too, because especially on long range scales, we're definitely way more probabilistic, you know. So we can say, yes, there's a certain percentage confidence of things being above, near, or below normal. And we actually got a lot of questions about this too. A lot of people, hey, how much do you think we're getting this year? Well, this is where you want to pay attention, because we don't do every city, but we do a couple of major ones across the Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and Midwest, where we kind of give a lay of the land. So for each city here, we give you the 30-year median total, not quite the average. We chose the median here to kind of give a better representation, because sometimes one or two big or quiet years can skew that number. It makes it just kind of unhelpful at some level. So I want the 30-year median here. And we also at the bottom include what the seasonal snowfall total was the year before for that particular location. And based upon the medians and some standard deviations, we came up with those three ranges you talked about, and we put odds on each particular one coming to fruition. Um, all things being equal in these cases, each one of these boxes would be 33%. So if everything was equal, which it really never is in meteorology, but if it was, every box would have a 33%. And we kind of took what we think the forecast maps look like and put a percentage on each one of these. So in the areas where we saw a little bit below normal, we're going to lean more in the below normal kind of range. For example, like in Hartford, where we've got 40% chance of below 36 inches. But a pretty darn close similar number in that normal box too. So that kind of shows that we're kind of on the cusp between that normal range and maybe slightly below. And based upon the maps that we saw earlier, not surprising, the further south you go, the numbers will diminish in the below normal category and increase in the normal and above categories. So in this case, we'll stay with Hartford, for example. 35% near normal and still 25% chance above normal. There's definitely some upside potential in central and southern New England. So, in addition to just looking at that number, you also want to think 35 plus 25. So that's a 60% chance of normal to above normal snow. So there's a better chance that we're at or above than we are below in Hartford in our estimation. Again, we're probably leaning slightly on the lower end of the normal scale, but again, it's still that close. And especially in a pattern like this with a busy subtropical jet stream, you can cash in on 1, 2, and maybe even 3 bigger storms, and that snow can pile up pretty quickly if the timing's just right, especially if we get anything earlier in the year, which is basically just going to be a bonus on the seasonal snowfall total.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's important too to look at some of these totals from last year. I mean, it's no secret. We all know that there was a lack of snow last year, especially the further closer to the coast you got in a lot of places here in the Northeast. I mean, for example, New York City, 2.3 inches on the year. But I think it's important to see that we're favoring that normal category. And even if it's on the slightly lower end of that, you were still going to be looking at that 21-inch mark, so significantly more than what we were expecting last year. And I think that's basically a hallmark of what we've been seeing, at least after we've had lean years. it comes back, and the following year typically shows an increase in snowfall. It might not be above normal at times, but it at least gets you closer to what you should be expecting for the year. So I think there's a lot of potential, and like Ken said, with that El Nino kicking in the extra moisture, I always like that as personally as a forecaster, because then we have some good moisture and precipitation to work with. We're not basing everything on storm dynamics and things like that. So if we head further south, Ken, into the mid-Atlantic, that's where we're seeing the percentages skewing more to that near to above normal category. And that's basically due to that extra moisture that we were just talking about.
Yeah, exactly. The closer you are to that subtropical jet stream, the chances skyrocket for above normal precipitation, basically. And with a seasonable to even below normal temperatures at times, again, we'll talk about a little bit more on the winds in a little bit. You're going to cash in on that. And these numbers here, like you mentioned, they're not exactly bright spots for snowfall here, but and we talked about this. You mentioned it too. It's just hard to get two of these years in a row. If we almost should have snuck in like a fourth box in there, like less than 5, and we probably would put like a 5% in those. It's going to be nearly impossible to see what we did last year, especially the further south you go, where there's just tons more moisture to work with, and
Yeah.
those colder temperatures as well.
Yeah, I would agree there, and you can definitely see those reflected in these numbers, where you're seeing areas like Washington, D.C., even having a big 50% on above normal. Now, granted, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room in these numbers, because inherently Washington, D.C. doesn't see all that much snow in a typical year. When you look at the averages, about 10 inches or so. But a significant lean above normal here, above 13 inches, will be a big change from the zero point 0.4 that they saw last year. So I think if those are people are looking for snow down the Mid-Atlantic, this is a year that has much more potential than the previous years. And as we move out into the Midwest, we start to see things shift around a little bit. So if you're closer to the Great Lakes, or farther away from that storm track that we're eyeing up further to the south, you do see that, we're on that near to below normal side of things when you get towards Chicago. But notice, we're still pretty high in that normal category here in Chicago. And then as you get further away out towards Rockford, things start dropping off. So Chicago might be ending up sneakingly good here this year.
I
Maybe
agree.
some lake impacts here that do happen. We saw that show up in the analogs a few times. Same thing around Detroit too. But and then we get down to Indianapolis, we get down to Pittsburgh, we're still looking at decent amount near that normal category. And that's, like I said before, in that transition zone where we have that active storm track to the south, there's going to be times when we get those aberrations, and that jet stream pushes north a little bit more, and then you start getting skirted by some extra storms and extra moisture. So I think we're going to see that happen, Ken, from time to time this year, especially as we get later in the year. And then also into the Ohio Valley, you can see right here that we're seeing the same sort of idea, where, we're favoring that normal category a little bit more, just a little bit closer there to that moisture
Exactly.
peak.
And I would say, that's probably where the forecast is probably the most volatile. There would probably
Mm,
be a sharp cutoff somewhere between where some place cashed in on 2 or 3 storms and, 50, 75 miles north didn't. And the further you kind of go north, the less chance you have of cashing in big time. But
yeah.
the further north you get too, you're just more inherently cold and you got a little bit more lake influence. So that'll help offset things a little bit. But yeah, there's gonna be a tight belt in there, probably Ohio Valley-ish into the Appalachians, especially on the fringe of those 1 or 2 bigger storms we're expecting for the East Coast.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are our snowfall projections. Hopefully you saw an area that was close to where you're servicing or living, to give you an idea of what kind of snowfall you can be expecting for the season as a total. But we want to dive a little bit more into the analogs, or those similar seasons, because that's what really is at the heart of a lot of our forecasts, a lot of our long range forecasting here. And it's important to know that the data we're going to show you next is kind of a sum, or an aggregate of all the analog years. And it's basically spitting that out at you, what we're finding in those years. not necessarily favored or weighted towards one year or another. So it's not explicitly a forecast, but it just gives you a better idea of what we're seeing from those similar years and some possible outcomes and some extremes too. So if we're going to move on here, we're going to look at the 2-inch events across the Midwest, okay? And I think it displays it nicely here that the 2-inch events are near to slightly below average region-wide, but it's important to note that there's still going to be 20 plus measurable snow days, it seems, north of I-70. So even though we're not seeing those bigger storms, it's still active. There's still some systems moving through, and I think that's the big takeaway point here. So we're not looking at a shutout, and that's something that I think our long range guy, meteorologist Kyle Leahy, has said a few times. It's not going to be a shutout. It's just that, hey, they might not be those larger caliber storms, but still something you're going to have to work with, that's for sure. And the areas closest to normal are going to be those ones when you get closer to the mid-Atlantic storm track. So, areas further south are going to have a better chance at seeing those 2-inch plus events. So moving on to the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic, that's where we looked at the 6-inch plus event because that's something that we see show up in our analogs. A few big years in there in our analog set that we're finding. One really significant one was '09 and 10. Now that was an extreme year, but it does show similar characteristics to what we're seeing this year. It's hard to say that you're going to see that extreme amount of snow like you saw in the Mid-Atlantic back in 2009, 2010. I think it was something like 70 plus inches that fell over the season. And the whole Snowmageddon thing, I believe, was coined by the media during that year. So it's hard to say that, okay, we're going to go to that extreme. But it's important to note that when we look at these 6-inch plus events, that we're seeing that trend here towards more of them once you get towards Philadelphia and areas south towards Baltimore, Washington, and even Richmond, Virginia. So that's a good signal here. Kind of towards normal as you head towards Allentown, New York City, and then a little bit below normal as you get up to Boston and Hartford. But again, it's not to say it won't snow. It's just the fact that maybe you don't see the greatest likelihood of those big, larger events. And two, inherently, Ken, as you go further north, you tend to see more of these 6-inch plus events. So that kind of is something you have to reference when you're looking at this data too.
Correct. And you can kind of see like the analog average from Boston to DC is almost around the same number. So that just, inherently we know Boston snows more than DC. So that just kind of, it makes the point more emphatic that,
Yeah.
the further south you go, it's best chance we've seen in a while for a big upside year. And,
Yeah.
just looking at this here, I've looked at this chart, I don't know how many times we look at these charts over the course of the past couple of weeks, dozens. Hartford's number there speaks to maybe a sneaky good spot in there somewhere where you might think
Mm,
you're in New England, so you're slightly below normal, but that's a pretty darn close to normal number. So
right.
don't just because you're not necessarily in Baltimore or Philadelphia or areas where we're kind of talking about above normal snow. Hartford just might be a sneaky high spot.
Right, absolutely. And we did have a question on the registrant list that a guy in central New Jersey, I believe his name was Kyle, has a 6-year-old son. He's wondering how many snow days am I gonna have, Dad? Basically, is what he was asking. And we did check with our long range guys, and he's thinking more along the lines of 3 for snow days this year. So we'll see how that pans out. But that was a fun question from our registrants there. So moving on, Ken, these are those temperature trends that we're pulling out of the analogs too, and I think it's pretty apparent what we're seeing, across the Northeast, and then as you head across the country too.
Yeah, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and Midwest. I mean, the big takeaway here are these big cold anomalies in February. And we talked about the analogs. This is just the percentage of the number of analogs. So I think there was nine analogs, whatever the number was. So in the case of New York City, 56% of them were below normal across all the Februaries of the analogs. 33 were near normal, and probably only one was above normal. So that just kind of goes to show you that. And again, kind of like counterintuitively, the further south you go, the more likely it was. Look at Washington, D.C., they're sitting at 78%. So
Hmm.
this gives you even more of an idea. Um, and to your point of not shutouts, especially early on in the year, there's definitely a mild trend in these November and December numbers. But again, there's third to half of these, if not slightly more, that are at or below normal at times. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. We're going to lean on the normal side this year, especially because we're generally in a warmer pattern the last 5 to 10 years. But again, there's definitely some signs there that there will be cold air at times. But like we often see in El Nino winters, early cold doesn't tend to have a whole lot of staying power. So think more transient. And then just kind of for comparison's sake, we showed all that below normal temperatures in the south. There it is in Amarillo. It's not a shutout, but man, that is pretty darn
Yeah.
telling that we're
Uh,
start to finish solidly below normal. And I think as impressive is just the so few instances of above normal. The normal ones there are at about a quarter to a third of the time, whereas there's just countable instances of above normal temperatures. So that's where we have the actual highest confidence that your temperatures will be below normal. Like there's basically no way around that. Maybe you have a couple of weeks here or there that are mild or even a little bit above normal, but again,
mhm.
the further south you go, it's just be cold, at least comparatively. Uh, Us northern folks would call it cool, probably, but it's all relative, right? And then just for a little bit more reference, we talked about the north not being it's cold being, or it's cold this year not being that cold, up and even in Montana. Um, Normal to above normal, but notice a little bit of an below normal lean in November. And our friends out there, maybe Montana, Upper Plains, maybe the northernmost Great Lakes, they might have a little bit of fun later this week and next. So a little bit of snow might not be necessarily the theme of the season, but certainly in terms of like cashing in on some early season stuff. Places that might not do as well as you would expect over the entire year might do better in the near term, especially in the northwestern part of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, Ken, because even in Chicago, you see a 56% below normal here in November. So we're going to have to watch that early signal there. It's not quite early on. It's not going to be quite that, lock, stock, and hey, we're going to be warm. So there is some chances in there, and we have to watch that carefully over the coming weeks here. But let's go into our outlooks, Ken. That's a good segue since you did mention the early November threat that there could be
Sure.
skirting across the plains. Um,
And to
Here
that
we
end, you
go.
see where that's we kind of have the cooler temperatures right there in the plains. We kind of have the warmth focused, and I shouldn't say warmth; it's just mild at this point, because even a quote unquote warm November and December is not exactly
Right.
warm. It's seasonably mild at this point. But yeah, so early season that there can be a couple of events for our friends, especially the further north you go into the plains and Great Lakes. Kind of talked about this, not still, below normal, but not quite a shutout either. We still have to watch for a couple, especially on the interior, some mixed events.
Hmm.
Those we kind of talked about in the key points from the Tennessee Valley on up, and even coastal areas that might struggle to see, snow, especially through December 15th and whatnot. That's not to say there's nothing to be done here, because I do think that there will be almost every time this time of year where you get a storm. I don't care what kind of storm it is, be it just a frontal passage to a more legitimate low pressure system. Cold air follows almost 95 times out of 100.
Yep.
Refreezes, maybe a little bit of an ending mix. So there's still really some things to watch out for, even if we do stay above normal to temperatures, and even if there's not a whole lot of snow. And lastly, November and December is not the main part of the snow season. So we're only looking at 15 to 20% of the annual snowfall occurring in November, December, and a lot of that is more weighted towards late December anyway. It's closer to 15% in areas that really don't snow too much early, not surprising. So coastal areas, mid-Atlantic, I think you have a slide that you were very interested on this too, to see how much snow can we actually expect in November, December, and sometimes the averages might be less than you think. And I know the media and retail industries, make us think that, oh yes, it's cold and snowy in December, but it's not necessarily the case. And we've been talking to a lot of our clients. We keep on hearing season starting a little bit later than it used to. And maybe instead of the first week of December, maybe it's more second and third week, and especially as you get into the Mid-Atlantic, more late, very late December into January.
Yeah, and Ken, I think you brought up a good point here with the 15 to 20% of the seasonal average falls during this time period because, look at the range here. We're not as below average as we can possibly get. We're not on the extreme here because we have to let that window open for maybe a perfectly timed storm that could kind of thread the needle here. And that's something I want to show to give some perspective on November and December. So let's take a quick look. These are the 30-year average amounts for November and December for a couple of cities here from the Mississippi River all the way through the East Coast. And it's important to note when you get further south, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Washington, D.C., you're not looking at a lot of snow on average during this period. Look at that, D.C., 1.8 inches. That's not a lot at all. And if we can get a storm to kind of thread the needle, that cold air lines up just right, and you get 2 inches of snow, all of a sudden you're near average. So it's not going to take a whole lot. Now, that order becomes a little bit of a taller task to achieve the further north you get. Allentown here, 5.5, Boston, 9.7, 9.4 in Chicago here. So it might take one or two systems to kind of sneak through to the pattern here. And then as you get up towards Albany and Minneapolis, again, a little bit more difficult. But I think what's important to know here is that out of our analog years, 3 out of those 9 analog years did see near to above normal snowfall for this part of the country. So it's not like it's an entire shutout that we see below normal snowfall, because there's still 3 of those years that show that, hey, there's potential here that we can see those above normal readings kind of get in there with the snowfall amounts. I mean, and it's all relative to, Ken, 6 to 9 inches total in November and December. Up further north, if you're in like Boston or Chicago, you end up with 6 to 9 inches during this time frame. It's still near normal, slightly below, and a lot more than we saw last year. So I think that's just an important thing to point out here.
Yep, and also, northern New England, maybe the first couple of days in November, maybe you think got some signs of some brief cold air around.
Right,
Maybe we put a little bit, not a massive number up there on the board, but I think
right.
some of these places, especially the ski resorts, might get a couple of inches, in about a week's time or so.
Exactly. So that's what we're seeing for November and December, and a few caveats as we ease into winter. Now, heading into January and February, that is when we're seeing the winter's worst is going to make its appearance. We're really starting to see those cooler temperatures creep up from the south, so we're seeing that happen. We're also seeing those above normal snowfall anomalies creeping up into the mid-Atlantic, even into places like the spine of the Appalachians, the Lehigh Valley, into New York City there, possibly even southern portions of New England get close to that above normal line there. So look, that's when all the analogs are saying that we're going to see the coldest weather and also the snowiest weather. That's one that we're seeing almost on every analog, Ken.
And not just the
Um,
analog, that's kind of normal for a lot. And once you start
right.
getting above the Mason-Dixon line, February is generally the snowiest month. So when you have the climatologically snowiest month lining up with a lot
Yep.
of the analogs being at the snowiest month, that kind of gives us pretty good confidence that, above normal snowfall, is very much in play, and we're forecasting with pretty good degree of confidence once you start getting into central and south Jersey. And I wouldn't be surprised, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we have a midwinter update coming up. We're going to probably make this gradient even tighter, and maybe we move it north a smidge, or we'll see what happens. But it's going
Yeah.
to probably be a pretty tight difference between where we go from above normal and possibly decently above normal to more
Right.
normal-ish to slightly below amounts.
And even though we are below normal with snowfall here across the northern portion out towards the Midwest, like Ken said, remember this is the climatologically snowiest portion of the year. So you still will see a decent amount of snowfall, just not above normal. That's just not the favored thing right now. But I think what is favored, Ken, is that if we look into February specifically, we're seeing a lot of bigger storms that are being shown on a lot of these comparable similar years. And that's when we're seeing those coldest temperatures, even into portions of the Midwest here, especially across the Mid-Atlantic. We're seeing increased blocking that may get going over Greenland, which basically you get a high pressure over Greenland. It blocks the storms from moving out so quickly and allows those nor'easters to kind of get going a little bit more on the coast, which is why we see that above normal snow anomaly showing up here. And the subtropical jet stays active, so we have a decent risk for those larger storms like I'm talking about. And if you look back at some of these years, prolific storm producers can. I mean, we had 0910, of course, is an
Correct.
extreme example, but also 15, 16, and I believe 02 and 03 all had some pretty big storms in there that hit the eastern portion of the United States.
Yeah, and just looking at our 3 bullet points there, I mean, as a meteorologist, those three are the best ingredients you can find for snowstorms. Cold temperatures, again, even if it is mild in February, it's still cold enough, you know. Blocking, that's a good one. And
Yep.
a busy jet stream, you add all that together. That's why we're pretty confident that there will be at least 1 or 2 bigger storms in there. Maybe everybody doesn't get in on them because of track issues, but the
Hmm.
players are on the field for somebody to have a very, very good February with a good amount of snowfall.
Absolutely, 100% agree with you on that, Ken. And then as we head into late winter, March into April, we round out the winter season. We're looking at those temperatures to turn above average again. We're looking at the snowfall to be below average. So this is one of those years where we're not expecting winter to kind of persist and last a little bit longer into spring like we have been seeing as of late. So when we hit those spring months, it looks like spring will arrive and we won't have old man winter just hanging on for dear life like it has the last several years that we've seen. And any snow that falls will be most favored early in this time period, early to mid-March, that sort of idea. And then after that, it gets harder and harder, obviously, as spring begins. So Ken, I think that pretty much wraps out our winter forecast, but remember, we will have an updated winter outlook in January, probably early to mid-January, where we'll talk about where we've been so far and where we're going for the rest of the season. So we give you guys the latest information. So be on the lookout for that for sure. But if you want more frequent updates, Ken, Winter Risk is the place to go, isn't that right?
Yeah, we'll start that up later this week actually, and again twice a week. Just once this week because we're starting at midweek, but twice a week you guys get updates and this is more for beyond the near term. So this is like 6 days to really the end of the season. We twice a week we update what we call the week's days 6 to 14 period. We talk about what the threats are, what they're looking like. Again, we're probably not going to say you're going to get 7 inches of snow, but we'll say your chance of getting a plowable type event are this. This is what we're watching. This is why it might not pan out, even though it looks good on a model right now. We try to tame down the hype and talk about what the more realistic outcomes are, and maybe somewhat what those extremes are, maybe their relativeness as well. Then as we get further out, we kind of just look at the percentage possibilities of lighter snow events like salting, then up to plowable, and then those 6+ inch events. So I would imagine these updates will look very colorful. A lot of high risk start coming out as we start to get to late in January and February when we get the meat of the winter to be there. And then all along too, here in this webinar, we did bi-monthly outlooks. We'll start putting monthly outlooks out as we go through the winter. So we'll update those as necessary, at least once or twice a month, to kind of give you a flavor for how the season's evolving. So it's kind of like an ongoing updated winter forecast right through the season that our teams is currently working on to get the graphics up for our clients later this week, and we'll be there all year long. And if you're interested in that, give us a call or email us at sales@weatherworksinc.com. We'll be sure to set you up with a trial if you're interested, and hopefully get you on board with that product for the winter season.
Absolutely. So that is it for our webinar. Remember, we are here for you from anywhere from winter risk to our storm alert service to our certified snowfall totals for verification after the storm. We have everything you need for the snow and ice season. So please visit weatherworksinc.com. That's where you'll find information on all those products. And also visit our social media channels. Just search WeatherWorks and you will find us. And if you're looking for past webinars, visit our YouTube channel. We have a lot of information there too. So thanks everyone for being with us today. Thanks Ken for co-hosting the webinar with me, and we will see you next time.